So far, we've talked about the evolution mechanisms through natural selection, gene flow, genetic drift, and those ideas. And now in this lecture, we're going to talk about the evolution of biological diversity, how we got so many different kinds of species on Earth. In the last lecture, we talked about microevolution, which was the change of genes and gene frequencies within a species so that we get different characteristics of that same species. It's like different types of dogs and how they look different, but it's still a dog. Different types of birds, but still the same species of bird. In this lecture, we're going to talk about macroevolution, which is the evolution of different species from each other, which is what we call speciation. And so on the right here, we've got two different theories for that. We've got non-branching evolution, where we start out with an original species of bird. It's going to evolve over time into a new species, and this one will no longer exist. Versus branching evolution, where we start out with one type of bird. It still exists over time, and then we get this branching of a new species of bird. But the original one still is around as well. Before we get into the details of this, we need to talk about what a species actually is. So species is a group of interbreeding populations that are reproductively isolated from other groups. So, humans are a species. We can interbreed with each other and produce fertile offspring, but if a human were to try to breed with, a dog or a cat or, a cow, there wouldn't be any successful offspring, okay? So a species is able to interbreed with each other, but not with any other species. So, dogs and cats are two different species because if they try to, interbreed, then they will not produce any viable offspring. So that's why they are considered two different species of animals. So the definition of a species is, if you mate, can you produce a viable offspring? So obviously there are some reproductive barriers that cause different species to evolve or become different from one another. So these are called prezygotic and postzygotic barriers. The prezygotic barriers, basically the barriers that can affect speciation before individuals try to mate, are temporal isolation, habitat isolation, and behavior isolation. So temporal isolation is like a factor where mating or flowering, if we're talking about plants, occurs at different seasons or times of day, so they never kind of get with each other. Habitat isolation is, different populations of animals or plants are going to live in different habitats, so they never get to meet. Okay, so they can't ever produce offspring. And then behavioral isolation is, where they have like little or no sexual attraction between males and females. So again, if there's no attraction there, they are never going to make viable offspring. We can also have mating barriers, mechanical isolation, where, there's differences in genitalia, or if we're talking about, flowers, differences in kind of the structure and the mechanism of reproduction. Okay, the reproductive parts don't fit. Okay, and then gametic isolation is where the male and female gametes are going to fail to unite to fertilize. Okay, so all of these can basically isolate or cause a difference between different species. The postzygotic barriers happen after fertilization. So okay, great. We can get two species to mate, and it can the egg and sperm can unite. Parts fit. It's all good, except we can have what's called hybrid inviability or hybrid sterility. So hybrid inviability includes the failure of the zygote to actually develop or reach sexual maturity. And sterility is, where, it can make it can make an animal or a plant, but, okay, that animal or plant is sterile. Okay, it's not able to make babies. So there's kind of, one generation there and then it dies off. So an example of that we see nowadays is mating horses and donkeys. Okay, so they're two, different species. They can mate, but their offspring, which is a mule, are sterile. Mules are not able to produce viable offspring. So that's what we call post-zygotic barriers. They're able to make, offspring that can live, but those offspring cannot, produce more offspring to pass on the genetics and make viable babies. All right, so how do we get different species of plants and animals? Well, there's two kind of different ways. One of them is what we call allopatric speciation, where you have a block in gene flow because of a physical barrier. So that's kind of this method here, where we've got, a patch of green fern trees, and over time we get erosion to make a riverbed that splits the two, splits it in half, and one part is going to, have lots of microevolution and different mutations and stuff that are passed down to make a different species on one side of the barrier than the other, that eventually they are so different that they can't produce, viable offspring with each other. So that's kind of allopatric speciation. There's a physical barrier between the two different, growing species. Now there's also sympatric speciation, which is new species that develop without geographical isolation. So that's kind of like this side, where, some of these trees are just, getting new mutations and stuff like that, quicker or differently than others, and over time it creates such a difference that those two different kinds of trees can no longer make viable offspring. So we call them two different species. So they just kind of pop out of nowhere in between all the other ones. So that's what we call sympatric speciation, where there's no geographical isolation. It's just microevolution to the extreme, where they can no longer mate with each other and create viable offspring. So when we talk about sympatric speciation, okay, this can occur over just one generation if the genetic changes that are made produce a reproductive barrier. If those changes are specifically affecting the reproductive organs of that particular plant or animal. It's super rare in animals to go through sympatric speciation, but it can occur in about 1/4 of all the plant species. And most of these are polyploid, which means that there's more than 2 sets of chromosomes, which are going to go under genetic mutation to make changes in the genes that affect the reproductive organs or the reproductive mechanisms of that species. So looking at the fossil record, they've noticed that many species kind of just appear suddenly in the fossil record, which is what we call punctuated equilibrium, okay, where we have, one species that we see for a while, and then all of a sudden this new one suddenly appears, and this new one suddenly appears, and now we've got 3 different kinds of species that can coexist. Okay, so that's different than the gradualist model, where we just kind of have a slight sudden change, not sudden, but slight changes over a period of time. So that's kind of 2 different tempos or speeds of speciation. So many can develop over a few thousand years, but appear suddenly in the fossil record. So, and a lot of times, the fossil record is incomplete. Not every species of plant or animal survives to fossilization. A lot of times they're broken down in the rocks, and stuff like that. So we may not be able to see the gradual change in species over time with the fossil record, because, of, and even erosion and all that stuff can be a factor in the fossil record. So the fossil record gives us some clues, but is not a perfect picture of the different species that have lived in the past. All right, so when talking about biological diversity, there's two different kind of branches or things we can focus on. Systematics is the study of the biological diversity of both the past and the present. And taxonomy is the identification, naming, and classification of species. So as we are studying systematics, we like to, humans like to have order in things. So we're going to also have or do what's called taxonomy, which is identifying new species, naming them, and then classifying them, in comparison to each other. So the branch of biological taxonomy dates back to the late 1700s to a guy named Linnaeus. He was a botanist living in Sweden, and he was, looking at different plants and trying to identify the different kinds of species and give them names that can be related to each other if they're related in, in ancestry. And so this is kind of how he got, the idea of naming and identifying different kinds of species and relating them to each other. So there's two main characteristics when we talk about taxonomy. There's two-part name for each species, okay, and there's a hierarchical classification of species into, from broad, these are all animals, to very specific groups of organisms, the felines versus the canines, and then, even down to individual species within those smaller groups. So when we talk about the names of taxonomy, each species is going to have a two-part Latin-based name. The first part we call the genus, and that one's capitalized. Okay, and the second part of the name is the species. Okay, so you have a genus, which is the first part, and the species, which is the second part, and the species is lowercase. So, if we're talking about the human species, our taxonomy name is Homo sapiens. Okay, Homo being the genus, sapiens being this particular species within that genus. So again, there's a hierarchical order of classification, and the last two are what we call genus and species. So they're the specifics of taxonomy. So here we have a slide explaining this hierarchical classification system. So down here at the bottom, it's super broad, right? We have the domains of life, the archaea, the bacteria, and the eukarya. Okay, then it goes, down to kingdoms. Okay, well, within eukaryotic species, we've got plants and animals and stuff like that. So in this particular thing, we call it a kingdom, and this is kingdom, Animalia, which is the animal kingdom. And then we can take a little, more focused look and look at the phylum. So Chordata is a phylum of all the animals that have backbones. Okay, and then a little closer look would be a class. So class Animalia. So these are not Animalia, Mammalia. So these are all the mammals. And then we can do a closer, kind of organization, which is order. And then we've got family. And then here, what we talked about before is the genus, and the species. Okay, so this is kind of like, focusing, going from broad to very focused way of classifying animals and plants as well. But this particular one shows the animal kingdom. So kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Okay, is kind of the order from going from broad to specific. So from high school, the way I remembered, kind of the order of classification was kings play chess on freeway, get smashed. Okay? Or you do kids play chess on freeway, get smashed. Okay? It's cheesy, but hey, if it helps you remember, great. And this basically kind of just takes a look at the same level organization and goes from very specific to broad. So, like we saw before, we can have very specific species group called a genus, and the genus are grouped, into families, and the families are grouped into orders, and the orders are grouped into classes. The classes are grouped into phylas, and the phylas are grouped into kingdoms. Okay, so this is just kind of a very, it's a way to order the world, put organization into this world that humans like to do. All right, so the very, very broadest is a domain. So those kingdoms are grouped into domains. And there's currently 3 classifications of domains. We have the bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Okay, so bacteria include bacteria, archaea, or single-celled organisms, and other types of single-celled organisms besides bacteria, and then the eukarya are all the eukaryotic kinds of plants and animals and fungi and all that stuff. So if we take a look at a particular group of animals, like everybody in the panther genus, we can call that. We can take a look. The leopards, lions, and tigers are all related to each other, closely related to each other. They're in the same genus category, and so the leopards are we call them Panthera pardus. And then the lions are Panthera leo, and the tigers are Panthera tigris. Okay, so they're all related to each other. They, kind of look similar in their structures and functions. They'll have different coloring and different hair types and stuff like that. But you can tell by looking at them that they are related. And so we've organized their relation in this manner. When we classify things, we can see how they are related to each other and perhaps how they can fit with one another in the evolutionary history of a species. And that's what we call a phylogenetic tree. It is basically this tree of branches where we can see where they're all kind of related down here at this level, and then we see the splitting off of the different species over time. So this is the carnivore order. Carnivores are going to be, predators, meat-eating kind of animals. So we've got, the different families, which are, the feline family, the canine family, the mustelid family. And then from there we can get, the different species, genus and species from there, the different kinds of canines and dogs and different kinds of panthers, cats, and stuff like that versus the smaller little canines like skunks and otters and those types of things. So we can, when we order and figure out, the classifications of species, we can then kind of trace them back to, common ancestors, back in the day. We've talked previously about homologous versus analogous structures. Homologous structures are structures within different species of animals that look similar because they have a common ancestor. Now, they might function a little bit differently, but they have basic similarities because there's this common ancestor that they all kind of evolved from. So more closely related species are going to have more homologous structures than species that are, further, along in, further apart in the evolutionary phylogenetic tree. So they may have a few things that are similar, but they're going to have, more things that are different. Ones that are more closely related are going to have a lot more homologous or similar structures to each other. Now, analogous structures are structures that may look similar, but they actually are not inherited from a common ancestor. So that is analogous structures. So we can have different species that can have, similar structures, but they are kind of not based on a common ancestor, what we'll call convergent evolution. They just kind of sprung up on a different branch of the evolutionary tree, but are going to be looking similar to other, structures in other branches of the tree. It's interesting to note that biologists and taxonomists, when developing phylogenetic trees and classifying organisms, they actually just focus on the homologous structures because those are the ones that are going to make sense to them in the evolutionary process. If two things have similar structures, they must have a similar ancestor. So they kind of just ignore the analogous structures a bit because they don't quite fit into the evolution theory. So that's kind of interesting to note when looking at phylogenetic trees. They are just purely based on homologies, homologous similarities between organisms. More recently, taxonomists have been looking at, the comparing of genes and gene products like proteins and the evolutionary relationships between different species. So they've been kind of throwing the genes and the proteins into the phylogenetic tree to see how they fit as well. And so, and we can see that closer species are going to have more similar DNA and protein sequences than species that are further apart in the evolutionary tree. So, and that makes sense with, homologous structures as well. The closer you are in the evolutionary tree, the closer your DNA is, so the closer your phenotypes, the structures, the outward structures are going to be. So that also, fits with the phylogenetic type of system that we have. As time has gone on, since, the late 1700s when phylogeny and taxonomy has started, we have seen, scientists looking deeper and deeper into these phylogenetic or evolutionary trees to find, similarities and common ancestors between the different species of animals and plants. So we'll call that is kind of cladistic. Okay, cladistic analysis is the search for clades or common ancestors and all the descendants, of a particular branch of the evolutionary tree. And so they're going to, it's kind of like, a specific part or specific task of the evolutionary tree is to look for these common ancestors and figure out the descendants and how they're kind of all related. So this process is going to center on the analysis of, like we said, homologous structures between the groups. But we always have, kind of those difficulties that arise. We can't quite tell which came first or how they're specifically related. But for the most part, we can see, okay, these guys are related. They've got similar structures. They're going to, branch from each other as opposed to other different species. So, if we take a look at this particular branch on the right of the evolutionary tree, it consists of lizards, snakes, crocodiles, and birds, which are thought to have a common ancestor. So in this little branch, we won't see, any insects or, bigger animals like mammals and stuff like that. So looking for some common ancestors between different species within the phylogenetic trees is what we call the Cladistic Revolution. So kind of like all science, it's a work in progress trying to figure out, what has happened and how, different species have gotten here. So, back even in, the 1970s or 1969, 70s, we had actually a 5-kingdom system proposed by a guy named Whitaker, and the 5 kingdoms were Monera, Protista, plant, fungi, and animal. Okay, Now in the 90s, okay, we've kind of shaved that down into 3 what we call domains, which are bacteria, archaea, and then eukarya. So it's a work in progress. I'm sure it's going to change over more time as we learn about different species and figure out, how they're related. And so the different classifications kind of depend on, which scientist you're talking to and who believes what and stuff like that. So it can differ depending on what sources you are relying on. So that's going to wrap up this, evolution of biological diversity. So kind of, the more macroscopic version of evolution, figuring out how different species came about. And you can see that natural selection does give us a clue of how we can get different phenotypes within a species. But the macroevolution, going from species to species, is a little less clear scientifically. So that's something that people are still working on to solidify and figure out.